Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel for our Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Peasant Cube update. The cards have been out for a while and we finally landed on some changes to our Peasant Cube from the set. On first glance, there's actually quite a few changes this time, with a few small sub-archetypes leaving and entering at the same time. As with the previous videos, I'm not going into depth about cards that are leaving the cube. I'm only focusing on new additions from Kamigawa, but there are a few critical decisions being made here that you should know about up front. First, we're nixing the black-white life gain sub-archetype. We've been cutting back on it more and more, and it's finally reached the point where it's just a bit too undersupported to come together at 450 cards. Second, as with the unrestricted cube, we're testing out a slew of ninjas this time around. It's a fun mechanic that bleeds over into blue-white flyers territory, so there should be some cool interactions happening there. Finally, we never got to talk about Innistrad Alchemy on the channel. At the end of this update, I'll very briefly touch on a few of the alchemy cards that made their way in from the last batch, and we'll have to figure out when to address future alchemy cards for these update videos. And the last bit of housekeeping, every subscribe or like on this video helps a bunch, and if you're looking to draft this Peasant Cube yourself, there are links to our Discord channel where we coordinate all of our weekly drafts in the description down below. Okay, let's talk Neo. To start things off, I think most of our invested players would expect this good boy to make the cut, and so it did. Unlike Unrestricted Cube, there isn't an explicit blink deck here, but white decks still have good ways to use a cheap cantrip and body as an advantage, whether that's suiting up with counters or equipment, or for you sick people out there, sacrificing the dog to the blood gods for your aristocrats decks. Hey, we don't judge here. It's not really a secret that certain enchantments have been dominating the Peasant Cube as of late. I'm looking at you, Abiding Grace. There are two options to approach that problem. Either we trim back on powerful enchantments like Weaponize the Monsters or Warlock class, which weakens the color ever so slightly, or we find additional ways to provide answers to problematic permanent types. We've made a few moves to increase the density of disenchant effects in the cube, with Banishing Slash being our newest disenchant from Kamigawa. I said the same thing about Beseiju in the Unrestricted update, but I'll say it again here. Hiding disenchants on an already main deckable card is a great way to increase interactivity in the cube without dedicating slots to explicit sideboard cards. In this case, Banishing Slash is white-white to destroy a tapped creature, but you get to free roll a disenchant on top of that. White-white is a hefty cost for creature removal, and the 2/2 Night text isn't likely to matter much, but you're still getting a versatile catch-all spell here. My only complaint is that I associate the word banishing in Magic with exiling, and this card destroys instead, but that's a small gripe. I think it's healthy for the growth of your cube to test out cards that you're not 100% sure about. Everyone knows how a card like Spirited Companion is going to play out, and that makes it an easy card to find room for. It's less obvious what the role of a card like Imperial Recovery Unit will be, but it caught my attention, and that's usually enough to at least test it out and see where it lands. We've seen this small ball creature recursion ability on white creatures before, but past iterations have usually been frail 2-toughness creatures, meaning you're often offering up your attacker as a trade in order to get back a smaller creature from your graveyard. The recovery unit has much more burly stats than we're used to with this effect, the caveat obviously being that it's a vehicle instead. We've seen ups and downs with vehicles. They're usually pushed in the stats department, but sometimes you just can't crew them and they sit around looking pretty sad. I'm intrigued by the stat line mostly, and crew 2 isn't unreasonable, so I'm making a case for trying it out. No shocker here, Touch the Spirit Realm is a great split card that lets us free roll a blink effect in the cube without sacrificing a slot used for interaction. Compared to other Oblivion Ring variants, it's a little disappointing that this misses on enchantments specifically, but the modality more than makes up for it. Again, we're not supporting a full-on blink deck at the peasant level, but there are enough Mold Drifters and value ETBs throughout that the blink effect will be meaningful in most games. It's worth noting that Ephemerate was printed at rare on Arena, so we don't currently have access to that effect for this cube, so this sort of effect is actually fairly sparse at the moment. Peasant Cube makes good use of good old 1/1 flyers in blue, or flying men, as they're colloquially known in the Magic world. Network Disruptor is a flying man that we didn't feel particularly excited about until we made the call to try out a ninja sub-theme, after which it became pretty obvious that the Disruptor has more of a purpose. Without the ninja synergies, Network Disruptor is really only useful at pushing flyers past reach creatures, and that's not really that powerful or even common of a play pattern. Add in ninjas and you've got a bit more going on. Not only does the Disruptor itself enable the other ninjutsu creatures, but it clears the way for your other ground creatures to get through and turn on ninjutsu. Aside from being an artifact, everything that makes this card good in Retail Limited should carry over to Peasant Cube, at least as long as ninjas is a supported theme. We're including pretty much every playable ninja in the card pool for density reasons, which includes Relic of the Past, Ninja of Deep Hours. We're not super keen on that card, but it's serving a purpose here. We also get to play with Ninja of the Deep Hour's much cooler out-of-town cousin, Moon Circuit Hacker, which is a modernized upgrade to the card in pretty much every way. Moon Circuit Hacker's ninjutsus for a single mana instead of 2, it still gets you that card on the first hit, and you can even cast it as a 2-drop that just loots when it connects instead. The biggest knock against Ninja of Deep Hours is the 4 mana casting cost when you can't successfully sneak it into play. Yes, Deep Hours draws a card every time it connects, and Hacker only draws once, and technically being an enchantment is a downside here, but it pushes all the right buttons in terms of casting cost and ninjutsu cost, whereas Ninja of the Deep Hours critically misses on its mana commitment. Oh, what's that? You want more Moon Ninjas? Oh, we got more Moon Ninjas for you. Moon Snare Specialist is basically Mana War in a ninja trench coat, and I'm here for it. So many blue decks are interested in a prolonged tempo game that even without ninjutsu, I can see decks picking the Specialist up. Obviously, it's not the most efficient creature when cast straight up, but it's not terrible either, and ninjutsu on this sort of effect is some sweet upside. Again, this is more of a density inclusion than a necessity, but better to go big on ninjas than to try it out and fall short. Mirror Shell Crab's an interesting modal card, this time a split between a 5/7 with some built-in protection and a cancel variant. It actually makes a lot of sense to view this card as a counterspell with the upside of being a creature rather than the other way around. As such, we trimmed a different counterspell to make room, which means the number of counters stayed the same, but the number of large blue creatures, for decks interested in such things, basically just Simic, increased by 1. It's not the most impressive creature on board, nor is it the easiest threat to push past or get off the board, so the creature half falls into a nice little nook. Also, it's another large threat that puts itself in the graveyard for decks looking to do some mid-game reanimation, same as Waker of Waves. It doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility to counter someone's spell on turn 3 and Blood for Bones the Crab back to the battlefield on turn 4, where it'll be the largest thing on the board. Notably, the counterspell half of this card can counter abilities as well, and while that alone doesn't make for an interesting counterspell, it's an added bit of functionality to a card that already has a fair bit going on. I always thought the modern age was just a bunch of Gen Zers walking across the road while watching TikToks on their phones, but it turns out it's just a saga that loots a few times and then turns into a flyer. Much better if you ask me. The modern age is one of those additions that comes from the card playing well in Retail Limited. I've been impressed with what this card achieves in Neon Dynasty drafts, and it seems like it has legs to stand on for Peasant Cube. Flyers is a supported theme, and it spots you a few early loots before it gets there. For what it's worth, we replaced Merfolk Looter to make room for this card, and I find this so much better. I won't get into details here, but the short of it is that I think Merfolk Looter is a card well past its time, to the point where I refuse to call it a good card anymore. If you want the full deets on why I feel this way, let me know, and I'll spell it out in a separate video. For now, it's time to leave Merfolk Looter in the past and join the modern age. The next saga was one of the more obvious shoo-in cards from the set. Behold, the Unspeakable does everything you want out of a mass draw spell. It makes it very hard to die the turn you cast it, it refills your hand the following turn, and leaves your mana completely untouched to cast your spells, and then it even spots you the back half, which can become an oversized flyer to close out the game, or bounce back to your hand and start the process all over again. Honestly, the back half isn't even all that necessary, since the first 2 chapters give you a new hand to work with and the time to cast those spells. It's still a 5 mana card, and you only have so much room, but it's such a potent card advantage machine that I think we'll be playing this one for a while. Compare it to Boon of the Wishgiver, which feels like game over when it resolves against you, unless you can punish them for tapping out right away. This is similar, but works in reverse. Boon refills your hand, then hopefully makes it hard for you to die. Behold, the Unspeakable nerfs the opponent's board, then gives you a new grip of cards to pull ahead. Full disclosure, I'm not very excited about this card, but our community seemed pretty high on it, so this one's for them. We've actually picked up quite a few creatures that fit this mold, that is, creatures that let you invest mana into turning other creatures into cards. Bushmeat Poacher and Skullport Merchant have both been good additions to the Attrition-y Sacrifice decks, but Dockside Chef lets us transfer that same ability to a more efficient point on the curve. It's a 1-drop, the activation cost is cheap and repeatable, and you can even sacrifice artifacts for cards like the Skullport Merchant. It is, however, a 1/2, which is the part that makes me hesitant. That's not traditionally a very good stat line for the Peasant Cube, and aside from specific X1s, it doesn't engage in combat very well. I've always been keen on attaching this sort of effect to 4 toughness creatures, even if they come down later in the game. Being a 1-drop is obviously more efficient, but playing this on turn 1 isn't exciting, since this sort of ability isn't very useful in the early game. We'll see where it lands. It could just be that the efficiency of the casting cost and activated ability outweighs the better stat lines on the more expensive counterparts. We've got a couple ninjas to talk about in black. They're less important than the blue ones since the black ninjas don't bleed over as well into other color pairs the same way the blue ninjas cross-pollinate with the Azorius Flyers decks. Still, if we want blue-black ninjas to exist as a sub-archetype for Dimir, then we want to play pretty much any ninja that looks even remotely playable. That's where we're at with Dokuchi Silencer. This feels like one of those one-and-done ninjas where you might sneak it in and trade a creature in hand for your opponent's best threat, but then never get to proc the ability again. Unless you're killing huge creatures, it's not even clear to me that trading a creature in hand is worth killing an opponent's creature, especially if you're targeting random ETB value dorks. Still, the more ninjas that exist in the card pool, the more consistent the theme gets, and there's a pretty high ceiling on the Silencer even if we're not convinced it'll come up often. Okay, I need everyone's help with this next one. Since Nezumi Prowler was leaked early on, I've been trying to get the name Ratlance Paragon to stick as an homage to Blacklance Paragon from Eldraine. I just need everyone to start calling this card Ratlance Paragon, and then I need a quarter as payment whenever someone says it. A Ratlance Paragon, you heard it here first. Great nicknames aside, this is a much more exciting ninja. It plays well in the decks it's intended for since it can punish a bad block, but you can also just cast this card straight up in a normal deck to get a big lifelink swing or threaten death touch on offense. It's also a 3/1 for 2 for black assertive decks, so yeah, there's quite a bit going on with this card. Not that it really needed it, but black sacrifice decks got another good tool in Gravelighter. The most direct comparison is to Plaguecrafter, which I think Gravelighter will overshadow most of the time. As far as just the straight up double-sided edict, I'd almost always rather have that effect attached to a 2/2 flyer than a 3/2 on the ground, and Plaguecrafter's bonus text of occasionally nabbing a planeswalker or sniping a card from the opponent's hand rarely matters. To be fair, the Fleshbag Marauder double edict text isn't insane in Peasant Cube, where most decks have small tokens and expendable bodies lying around, but it's still fine. Gravelighter has a little bit more play to it than these effects usually have, since the alternate mode lets you cantrip instead if a creature died the turn it enters play. You won't always get the effect you want, but you should be able to set things up in your favor more often than not. Well, let's start off red with the card that just keeps going, and going, and going. And if you get that reference, then you're old just like me. Anyway, we've seen equipment like Rabbit Battery before, and we've never really considered them. The problem with something even as efficient as Boots of Speed from AFR is that it does stone nothing without other creatures, and if you're getting any use out of it in the development stages of the game, it means you're playing off-curve to pay for the equipment cost. Rabbit Battery makes up for all of this by just being a little dude that chips in a few points of damage and keeps doing it post board wipe. If you ever reconfigure it, it means that you get the value of the equipment but still have a creature to work with should you run out of gas after a Wrath. It's not Red's best 1-drop, but good haste enablers are nice pickups, and Reconfigure has some intrinsically interesting decision making tied into the mechanic. I gushed about Reinforced Ronin for the Unrestricted Cube, and in a shocking twist, this is one uncommon that I think actually works better for that environment than in the Peasant Cube. In the previous update video, I outlined a couple combo-esque card advantage engines you can put together with the Ronin in the Unrestricted Cube, but there's a little less of that going on here. There, the most important part is the channel ability, and here its most important part is just being a hasty dude that attacks for 2 sometimes. It still has minor delirium synergies for cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler and Unholy Heat. It dodges sorcery speed mini sweepers like Golden Demise and Cry of the Carnarium. And hey, not that the card needed any more combos, but it does work favorably with Abiding Grace. Next up is our resident brass monkey, that chunky monkey. Much like Rabbit Battery, Simian Sling isn't an especially powerful one-drop on its own, but the reconfigure text adds another layer to the way this will play out. It chips in damage early and then provides an annoying, persistent way of dealing small bits of damage even through blockers. The reconfigure cost is just cheap enough to make this work, and I suspect it'll be a fine role player without being a top tier one-drop. Speaking of one-drops, the hits keep coming with Kamano Faces Kakazan. Seriously, this set has 4 playable red one-drops at the Peasant level. And for what it's worth, we added this card to the unrestricted cube last minute, but I didn't talk about it in that update video, so let's parse it out here. The real key to this card is making the second chapter matter. But if you manage to pick up the +1/+1 counter, your 1 mana investment results in a point of damage, an extra counter, and a 2/2 haste with relevant exile text tacked on. That's a lot for 1 mana. I spoke highly of the 1 mana Black Saga Okiba Reckoner raid in the previous video, and this saga dodges the biggest downside of that card. That is, the haste on Kamano means you don't skip a crucial attack, and you can keep the pressure on. Again, a lot of the power of this card is concentrated on hitting that second chapter, but it's also not the end of the world if you don't. Finally, we get an above average red 4-drop for the Peasant cube. That section of the cube could definitely use some love, and Twin Shot Sniper's a step in the right direction. Half uncounterable 2 mana shock, half Flame Tongue Kavu? Yeah, I'll take that card. I'm not saying it's the red Ravenous Chupacabra, but I'm also not saying it's not the red Ravenous Chupacabra either. I think this one's self-explanatory, it's just an excellent creature. Partly due to just how well Izzet decks have been performing, the red sweepers have looked a little oppressive as of late. I'm really just talking about Flame Sweep and any other Pyroclasm type effects we could be playing that we're currently not, like Cinderclasm or Crush the Weak. Seismic Wave is our newest addition, and it feels like it'll be one of those sometimes better, sometimes worse type cards when compared to other sweepers in this vein. You can set up Seismic Wave to always deal 3 damage to one target, so right there you get a slightly overcosted Lightning Bolt, but dealing 1 to the rest of your opponent's team feels like it will matter without completely shutting down aggro decks. It'll occasionally matter that the 1 damage effect misses artifact creatures, but that's more flavor text than a real consideration here. Oh, poor green, when will you get some truly excellent cards? Not this time, it would seem. I'm not dissing Blossom Prancer, it's a fine addition to the cube, it's just not revolutionizing green's 5-drops in any meaningful way. It's a cantrip creature that digs pretty deep for more action, stabilizes with reach, and gives you the option to gain life if that's what you need when you cast it. No complaints here at all, Blossom Prancer will get some mileage in the cube for sure, I just wish green had something a little more exciting to pick up from this set. Seriously, Blossom Prancer's pretty much it. We've got a couple new gold cards and colorless cards to mess around with. First up is the Relaxing Monkey Hot Spring, which is in direct competition with Rhythm of the Wild, one of Gruul's better cards if you ask me. Here's the big difference. You need to resolve Rhythm before it has an effect on your creatures, after which you're choosing haste or +1/+1 counters for each creature that hits the board. Invigorating Hot Spring gives you the best of both worlds since it grants haste and counters, but caps out at 4 activations before it stops growing your creatures. The big difference is that the Hot Spring can be used to bolster creatures you controlled before it came into play, so it's not a miserable top deck the same way Rhythm sometimes is. Of course, you run out of charges, if you will, but the modified haste text still matters for any creatures that just naturally pick up +1/+1 counters, and it makes all your equipment grant haste as well. There is one more point in the Rhythm camp, and that's that the uncounterable creature text actually matters for the blue control matchup, but that's the least important text of the card, and without it in consideration, it seems clear that the Hot Spring is the better version of this effect. We weren't originally interested in adding Gloom Shrieker because it rubs up against what Acolyte of Affliction is doing in the cube, and we gave the nod to Acolyte due to its ability to loop with other recursive pieces. However, just because Gloom Shrieker's a one and done deal doesn't mean it's not good enough to include as a second shot at this sort of effect. The Exile on Death Clause really stifles what this card could have been, but a one-shot Eternal Witness with Menace isn't anything to scoff at either. The aggressive body's a little bit anemic, truth be told, since you don't typically run these types of cards out on curve, but I'll take Menace over no extra ability at all. I don't think Gloom Shrieker is best in class, but it's still an excellent Golgari card. Alright, here's the card that I'm most excited for from this update. Colossal Skyturtle is everything I'm looking for in a Simic card for Peasant Cube. Remember, Simic has been the lame duck for pretty much the entirety of the Peasant Cube's run, and a lot of that is due to a lack of thematic depth and multicolor payoff. We've landed on the ramp plan as the best thing that Simic is capable of, but the problem is at Peasant you lose out on the best top-end threats that get printed for ramp decks, since they're usually busted rares and mythics. The common and uncommon top-end ramp targets tend to be expensive and easy to answer, even if they leave behind a bit of value. Your Sifter Worms, Bramble Worms, and Howlin' Giants are all good stabilizing threats to ramp into, but streamlined creature decks can invalidate that plan by killing you before you get to 7 mana. Skyturtle is only one card, but solves a lot of issues that Simic has. First, it's a self-contained Simic ramp payoff. Theoretically, non-Simic decks can play this as a monocolor card due to the single pip channel abilities, but if you're only interested in one channel ability or the other, there are much better options, so Simic decks should get the turtle more often than not. Second, it's a modal ramp target that gives you some form of interaction if you're under too much pressure. Nothing feels worse than being short on mana for your Sifter Worm in hand and just being stranded with a card you can't cast. Skyturtle spots you a cheap bounce mode when the game's not going in your favor, and the regrowth mode is a great option to have as well. Third and finally, as a ramp target, it threatens to end the game quickly and has built-in protection. Ward 2 on a 7-drop doesn't mean your creature's completely safe, but it does mean it can't be answered on the cheap. Your opponents will likely have to spend a full turn getting it off the board. I love this card and hope it provides a meaningful boost to Simic decks. Nobody was asking for a strict upgrade to Filigree Familiar, but we got one anyway. Insect is way less cool of a creature type than Fox, but everything about Circuit Mender is an upgrade over our familiar friend. Not that Filigree Familiar was ever excellent, it was just a deck smoother as a 3-drop colorless creature that could put a speed bump in front of the aggressive decks. Circuit Mender is more of a speed table in that regard, since it spots you an extra point of toughness and gives you the card draw no matter how it leaves the battlefield. Filigree Familiar had to die to draw a card. Circuit Mender gets you that card if it dies or gets exiled, bounced, or even ninjutsu'd back to your hand. That's a pretty sweet upgrade, even if it's sad to see our Fox friend go. At least we don't have to hear people say, "That looks familiar," every time it gets cast anymore. Nothing exciting here with Ecologist Terrarium. There are a handful of colorless flex slots that could all be interchangeably filled with mana fix and artifacts with minor upside. We replaced Renegade Map for the Terrarium simply because it has extra +1/+1 countertext, and that matters for a small subset of decks, but in all honesty, I don't see this getting played any more or less than Map. There was a small rally for Prophetic Prism, whose merits have been greatly exaggerated as of late by some community members, but if you ask me, Prism would be just as undesirable as any similar card we put in this slot. There have always been a few colorless mana fixers floating around, but it begs the question whether they're doing anything significant in a cube where multicolored decks aren't really that common or rewarding. Vroom! High Speed Hoverbike is a neat little tempo card that I could see making its way into Flyers decks or some low curve aggro decks. It's reminiscent of Nebelgast Herald just in vehicle form, and Nebelgast has always been a decent playmaker. It's also reminiscent of Sky Skiff, and even though it's clearly better on paper than Sky Skiff, the Skiff was one of the worst vehicles we've ever put in the cube. I think Flash Tap and Crew 1 all comes together to make the Hoverbike a neat package of a card for proactive decks, but we'll see if stapling that package to a vehicle makes it worse than I'm expecting or not. Okay, before we wrap up, I wanted to briefly touch on a few Innistrad Alchemy cards that I never got to talk about in a video. They all recently came in alongside the Neo cards, so we don't have a hard opinion about most of them yet, but we pulled 4 from the Alchemy release to try out. The first is Kindred Denial, which is a 4-mana counterspell that seeks a card with the same mana value as whatever it countered. I've played it exactly once, and as a gimmicky replacement for Dismiss, I was satisfied with the way it played. The cube doesn't have much room for 4-mana counters, but we thought it wouldn't hurt to at least test it over Dismiss, and it's doing a similar job, I think a slight bit better. Assuming you've got the right curve of cards in your deck, this will almost always find you another action piece, and it never draws lands the way Dismiss will, which could be a downside if you're actively looking for more lands. It was a little awkward the one time I played this that I had to hold it up for my opponent's expensive plays knowing I didn't have any 6 or 7 mana cards in the deck to seek if I had to counter something with that mana value. I find this a little interesting though, since Draft and Kindred Denial can incentivize you to pick up a card at a different spot on the curve than you otherwise would. Still, there is a fail case that you won't actually get a card when you counter a spell, which is pretty bad, but shouldn't happen too often. Tenacious Pup has some goofy, unappealing digital art if you ask me, and we're not in love with it, but at least the card is good, or at least we think it's good. Everything I said about the Red Saga Kamano Faces Kakazan is true of this card, with the bonus that you can't really miss on the +1/+1 counter the same way the Saga misses on Chapter 2 sometimes. Tenacious Pup tracks your next creature across turns, so even if you top deck it later and fail to hit another creature right away, the ability will carry over until you do eventually find another creature. The pup also throws a bunch of extra goodies your way, giving you a life for some reason, as well as a trample and vigilance counter on top of the +1/+1 counter. It basically sets you up to make a monster out of your next creature spell, and on curve this card can do a lot of work. It seems like a nice bridge between Gruul Beatdown and Selesnya counters, even if it doesn't seem like a card that other green color pairs will be interested in that often. We've actually had some experience with Settle the Wilds in the unrestricted cube, and I'd say it's been a success there, so I see no reason it shouldn't be about the same for Peasant Cube. It's half ramp, half tutor, although you only have minor control over both of those abilities. It seeks a land for you, so you don't get to necessarily find your splash mana the way you could with Cultivate. The card also seeks a non-land permanent for you, which you don't get to choose, although you can time this card to find a permanent at a certain spot on the curve. If I knew I only had one 5-drop or 6-drop in my deck, I could wait till the appropriate turn to cast this and get up to the correct number of lands and find that target. I think more often than not, you'll just jam this on turn 3, ramp up to 4 lands, and be happy with whatever 4-drop the RNG gods decide to put in your hand. It's satisfying to cast, and even though it looks like it rubs up against Cultivate's slot in the cube, they're pleasantly different enough that there's absolutely room for both of them. This last edition is a little sus, if we're being honest, but I think it has a role to serve here. Soulstealer Axe is an equipment that lets you seek a card with mana value equal to the amount of combat damage the equipped creature deals to your opponent. It gives trample to the equipped creature as well, which makes it read like an equipment you want for big beaters to push through your opponent's board. I don't think that's how you want to use this card though, and if the most recent iteration of the Arena Cube taught us anything, it's that Soulstealer Axe looked like utter garbage in big creature decks. No, I think we should be looking at this as more of a curiosity type card. Equip up a 1/1 flyer, get in that evasive hit, and fetch up another 1/1 flyer, rinse and repeat. The Flyers decks have tighter curves around the 1 and 2 drop slot, so small amounts of damage are going to net you cards more often than not, and the Flyers decks come equipped with annoying evasive threats to push the equipped creature through more often. Think about it like a curiosity and an equipment that can be moved around instead of an aura that dies with the creature. Again, this is all speculation, we haven't seen it in action yet, but I think if there's going to be a home for Soulstealer Axe, it'll be a deck full of small, hard-to-block creatures. Okay, that was a fairly big update for Peasant Cube. Peasant's actually come a long way over the last year or two, and the power level has increased significantly during that time. If you're still on the fence about Peasant just being a dumbed down version of what you love from Cube, I highly recommend joining us on a Wednesday night and giving it a swing. You'd be surprised by just how powerful and synergistic some of the decks end up. It's my passion project at this point, and I'm always excited to get new cards to tighten up the list. We'll have more alchemy cards coming our way soon, although I'm not yet sure how to approach those in video form, since the alchemy updates will be coming out about a month later than the main sets. If you have ideas or want to see standalone content about new alchemy sets, let me know, because some of the cards are unique and interesting. At any rate, thanks for joining us today to talk Kamigawa. We got a lot of slam dunk peasant cards as well as some speculative options, but most importantly of all, we got a colossal skyturtle. Remember to subscribe below for more content like this. Come find our Discord in the links below if you want to come draft with us, and leave a comment if you think we missed anything from the set. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you next time.